The terror began with the second act, when the so-called Black Widows stormed a Moscow theater and took 800 people hostage. Let's talk about it. Sergei Bundinsky and his daughter Irina had front row seats on the 23rd of October. They were there to see the play Northeast. The play was very popular, and every last ticket had been sold that day. The second act had just begun. 8 actors in military uniforms were dancing on stage, while the audience were clapping along, when all of a sudden a man in the audience jumped up and started shooting in the air with a machine gun. At first, most of the audience thought this was part of the play, but they soon realized the seriousness of the situation when 40 more terrorists stormed the theater. They brought with them 20 pistols, 18 Kalashnikovs, 100 hand grenades, and over 100 kilograms of explosive material. They used tape to put the explosives under the chairs in the theater, and they placed another one on stage, which by itself was strong enough to destroy the entire building. A few actors had managed to escape through the backstage windows, but 800 people remained as their hostages. When the actors notified the authorities, they told them something very strange. A lot of the terrorists were women. The so-called Black Widows had explosives struck to their body, and they were patrolling the theater to keep the hostages in check. As one hostage later recounted, they continued to scream the following: "We want to die more than you want to live." The leader of this group was a young Chechenian man named Moza Barashev, and there was only one thing they wanted: for the Kremlin to immediately remove its troops from Chechnya, where a bloody war had been going on since 1999. The Black Widows were women who had lost their sons and husbands in this war. To keep the negotiation going and to stop the authorities from storming into the theater, Mozar made them an offer. He would release all the people that had a foreign passport. As he told the negotiator, he had no problem with them, or their countries. There were 75 people from 14 different nations among the hostages, who at this point thought their torment would be over. But that wouldn't happen, because the Russian negotiator refused the offer. Either all hostages would be freed, or they would storm the theater. I'm not quite sure what the logic behind it was, since Moza didn't request anything in exchange for their release, and they could have told the people outside more of what was going on the inside. But this wasn't the only bad decision the authorities made. The terrorists, meanwhile, became more and more frustrated. They forced the hostages to call their loved ones. They wanted them to come to the theater and start protesting outside. All the while, the outside of the theater started to look more like a war zone. Tanks and soldiers started showing up, and police vehicles from all over Moscow. And in that chaos, the police somehow neglected to properly block off the entry to the theater, which led to a young woman, Olga Romanova, who was only 26, to just be able to sneak into the theater. She entered the auditorium and for some reason decided to start shouting at the terrorists, telling them to immediately release everyone. Moza thought the woman was an agent and he became enraged. 2 of his henchmen took Olga into the lobby, where they shot her. Somehow the press got wind of this, and this put even more pressure on the authorities outside. So they decided to act, and they made a fatal plan. In the early morning of the 26th, so 3 days after the hostage situation started, a special unit surrounded the theater. Sergei, who was there with his daughter, later recounted the following. 2 terrorists were sitting on stage quietly talking, when he suddenly saw a small white cloud appear from the air vents, and the auditorium filled with gas. The 2 men on stage immediately started shooting at the air vents, when all of a sudden flash grenades went off, and the members of the special forces stormed the theater. Sergei and his daughter were actually the 2 people that were first evacuated. But many of the hostages were not so lucky. The gas that the police had used was toxic. A lot of the hostages were unconscious, and then suffocated on their own vomit. And even the ones that made it outside weren't safe. The police hadn't gotten enough ambulances. Many people were only safe because the local buses stopped and took them to the hospital. At the end, the police managed to kill all the terrorists, but they also killed 130 hostages. The only hostage the terrorists killed was Olga. The Kremlin later denied that the gas had been toxic. They claimed the hostages had died from sitting too long and not getting food. Mind you, it was only 3 days. Till today, Russia refuses to admit what gas they had used.